My husband cheated on me with my best friend, and when I found out, they laughed, calling me boring. My name is Liv, and I lived in a small house in Portland, thinking I had it all, Dan, who promised me the world, and Sophie, who knew my secrets better than anyone. I trusted them like a fool, gave them my heart, and they trampled on it, laughing at my tears. I left quietly, but I came back with a life they would never touch. But then, that night, I stood in the doorway, listening to their laughter, and felt everything in me fall apart. It all started with little things that I ignored. Dan would come home late, smelling not of his work at the office, but of something sweet and foreign. Sophie canceled our lunches, her messages became shorter, her eyes avoided mine. I thought it was fatigue. Dan and I have been married for 6 years, and Sophie and I have been friends for 10 years. I cooked dinner, washed his shirts, listened to her jokes about my domestic habits. I was the stable, reliable Liv, the one who held everything together. But I didn't know that they only saw me as a shadow that they could get around. I found them by accident. It was a Friday, I came home early from work, the marketing firm let us go because of a system failure. I walked home holding a grocery bag and heard them, voices from our bedroom, low, mixed with laughter. I froze, feeling a chill rise up my legs. The door was open, and I saw them: Dan lying on the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, Sophie sitting next to him, her hand on his chest. They didn't notice me, too busy with themselves, with their little world they were building behind my back. I could have screamed, thrown that bag, smashed everything to pieces. But I stood there, listening to the knife cut deeper. Sophie giggled, her voice as light as a bell, as she said I was too boring, that I stayed home with books while they lived. Dan laughed, his low voice humming as he added that I didn't know how to have fun, that I was just a gray spot in his life. I felt the blood pounding in my temples, tears stinging my eyes, but I didn't let them spill. I stood there, holding that stupid bag of potatoes and milk, and I saw them laughing at everything I gave them. They didn't know I was there. I could have burst in and broken their laughter, but something inside me cracked, not with pain, but with clarity. I realized that they were not worth my screaming, my tears, my anger. I put the bag on the floor, as quiet as a ghost, and went to the kitchen. I took my keys, my bag, my old jacket, and left the house without looking back. Their laughter buzzed in my head like a swarm of bees, but I didn't stop. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove off into the night, not knowing where I was going, but knowing I wasn't coming back. I did not call, did not write, did not ask why. I drove, feeling the wind against the windows, and promised myself that this was not the end, it was the beginning. I was 32, I had a broken heart and a few $100s in my account, but I was not broken. Their words, "You're boring," swirled around in me like poison, but I swallowed it and decided that I would prove them wrong. Not to them, but to myself. I didn't know where I was going, but I could feel the strength growing inside me like a weed through the asphalt. Would I break? I sat in the car, holding the steering wheel, and felt the tears finally falling, not from weakness, but from the anger that burned inside me. I could have gone back, begged, fought, but I chose not to. I went ahead, leaving them in that house, with their laughter, their lies. Little did I know that years later I would return, not for revenge, but with a life they would never understand. I drove out of Portland at night, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers were white, with a bag and a few $100s as my entire life. I left the house where Dan and I shared a bed, where Sophie drank my coffee and called me sister. I left quietly, but I didn't break. I promised myself I would come back with a life they couldn't touch. But then I was just a shadow, running away from their poison, not knowing where the road would take me. I stayed in a motel an hour outside of the city, a dirty one with dim lights and a moldy smell. I paid $40 a night, sat on a squeaky bed, and stared at the cracks in the ceiling. Their words "You're boring," hummed in my head like a swarm of wasps, but I didn't cry anymore. I felt empty, as if someone had torn a piece out of me, but I didn't let it consume me. I opened my bag, pulled out my phone and saw it: 6 missed calls from Dan, 3 from Sophie. I turned it off, threw it on the nightstand, and lay down, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. I didn't read their messages. I knew they were lies, excuses I didn't need. The next day I drove on. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I wasn't coming back. I stopped in Seattle. The city was big, loud, alien, but I felt it calling me. I found a tiny apartment, 1 room, an old stove, a window on a brick wall. I paid a month's rent with the money I had and sat on the floor because there was no furniture. I looked at my hands, at the wedding ring that was still on my finger, and took it off. It fell to the floor with a soft clink, and I felt something in me let go, not of pain, but of shackles I had never seen before. I didn't call a lawyer right away. I wasn't ready for a war over the house or money. I left everything to Dan, let him have it, let him think he won. I quit my job in marketing. That company was part of my old life, where I sat in the office while he lied to me. I got a job as a barista in a small coffee shop. It smelled like coffee and bread, and I stood behind the counter pouring lattes for strangers. It was humiliating, from the presentations to the washing of the cups, but I kept my head up. Every dollar in my pocket was mine, not his, and it warmed me like a faint fire in the cold. I didn't tell anyone what happened. My colleagues asked why I was here, why I didn't have my things, but I smiled and changed the subject. I didn't want regrets. I wanted to start from scratch. I bought an old sofa for $20, a table from a sale, and a few books from a used bookstore. I read at night, listened to the rain outside the window, and felt the emptiness slowly fill in, not with joy, but with peace. I didn't think about them every second. Their laughter was getting quieter, though it didn't disappear. A month later, I realized that I could do more. I started looking for something of my own, not just survival, but life. I enrolled in photography classes. I had always loved taking pictures, but Dan called it stupid, and Sophie laughed that I couldn't see beauty. I took an old camera from a pawn shop and walked around the city, catching the light on the wet streets, the shadows of the trees, the faces of people. I felt something in me come to life, not the old Liv, but a new one who was not afraid to be herself. I wasn't boring, I was alive, and they didn't see it. I didn't know if they were looking for me. I imagined Dan sitting in our house, Sophie wearing my sweaters, them drinking wine and thinking I was broken. But I didn't break down. I walked forward, step by step, with my coffee in my hands and my camera around my neck. The first months were damp and cold, not just from the rain that pounded down the windows of my tiny apartment, but from the emptiness that buzzed inside me. I would get up at 6, drive to the coffee shop, stand behind the counter, smiling at the customers, even though my insides ached. Their words "You're boring," clung to me like wet clothes, but I didn't let them drag me down. I washed cups, counted tips, put coins in the jar as if it were my shield. Every day was a small battle, not against them, but for myself, for not disappearing. Photography became my breath. I went to classes twice a week, sitting in the back row, listening to the teacher talk about light and shadows. I would take my camera and wander around the city, taking pictures of puddles reflecting the sky, old trees, people hiding their eyes under umbrellas. My hands trembled at first, but with each click I felt something in me grow stronger. I wasn't boring, I was seeing a world they hadn't noticed, and that warmed me more than their promises ever could. I started posting photos on the internet, timidly at first, but people wrote, liked, and asked for more. I didn't expect it, but I felt wings growing where the wounds had been. The money from the coffee shop barely kept me afloat, but I didn't stop. I started taking small orders. I photographed coffee shops, flowers for shops, even one wedding party where the bride was crying with joy, and I stood aside, feeling a stab in my chest. I didn't envy her, I just remembered my marriage, which was a lie. But I didn't let it break me. I clicked the shutter, smiled, and took the check. I had saved enough to buy a better camera, and that was my first real step not away from them, but toward myself. I didn't think about Dan and Sophie every day. They became ghosts, fading into my memory. But sometimes I would see them in my dreams, his arms around her waist, her laugh cutting through the air. I would wake up gasping for air and go to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. I didn't hate them anymore. I felt indifference mixed with something sharp that I couldn't name. I imagined them living in that house, drinking wine, thinking that I was gone. But I wasn't gone, I was here, with coffee in my hands and light in the frame, and it was more than they could have imagined. A year later, I got my first big order. A local magazine wanted my photos for the cover. I was standing in the park shooting the fog over the lake when I got the call. I listened to the editor, holding the phone, and felt my heart beating, not from fear, but from something alive. I said yes without hesitation, and when the magazine came out, I saw my name, Liv Gray, photographer. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled for real. I was not boring, I was me, and the world was beginning to see it. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I could feel the ashes settling, a new life growing out of them. I bought myself a coat, not an expensive one, but a warm one, and stood on the street, watching people pass by. I was no longer the same Liv who cooked dinner for Dan or listened to Sophie. I was someone new, not perfect, not without scars, but alive. Would I ever forget them? I walked home holding the camera and felt their shadows fade. But I didn't know that fate was preparing another twist for me, not for revenge, but for the happiness I deserved. It happened 1.5 years after I left. I was shooting the sunset over the bay, the water was burning gold, seagulls were screaming in the sky, and I was standing on the edge of the pier, capturing the moment. My photos were already known in the city, magazines, galleries, even a small exhibition in the coffee shop where I used to wash cups. I lived simply, the apartment became cozy, with books and plants, but I was alone, and I liked it. I wasn't waiting for anyone, I wasn't looking for arms to hug me. I thought Dan had taken that part away from me, that I didn't know how to trust anymore. He appeared by chance. I was coming back from the pier holding my camera when some guy ran at me, knocking the coffee out of my hands. I felt it pouring hot on my jacket and looked at him, ready to snap at him. But he looked up, warm, amber eyes, wrinkled with laughter, and I froze. He began to mumble an apology, his hands fumbling for napkins, and I felt my anger melt away. His name was Nick, and he was a painter, with paint on his sleeves and a smile that dispelled my cold. I told him I was fine and walked away, but he caught up with me, offering to buy me a new coffee. I agreed, not knowing why. We sat in the coffee shop and I listened to him talk about his paintings, chaotic brushstrokes that catch the light like my photos. He didn't ask about my past, didn't pry into my soul, but I could feel his warmth seeping into me. I didn't talk about Dan or Sophie, I kept them under wraps, but with Nick I felt lighter, like I could breathe deeper. He laughed at my jokes, looked at me as if I were something more than I could see. I wasn't looking for it, but I went home that night feeling my heart beat a little faster. We started seeing each other more often. He came to my shoots, stood aside with a canvas, painting while I clicked the shutter. I would go to his studio, which was small, cluttered, and smelled of paint and turpentine. We drank cheap wine and talked about art, about how the world breaks us and how we fix it. I didn't throw myself into it. I was afraid, remembering how Dan promised me everything and then laughed with Sophie. But Nick was different. He didn't promise, he just was, and I started to trust that. One night he took my hand. We were sitting on the roof of his house, looking out at the city lights, and I felt his fingers touch mine, gently, as if asking for permission. I didn't pull away. I returned his hand, and we sat there, silently, feeling each other's warmth. I didn't know if it was love, but it was real, not a lie, not a game, but something pure that didn't suffocate me. I lay there that night, looking at the ceiling, and thought, can I accept this? Do I deserve this after everything? With Nick, I didn't feel boring, I felt alive. He saw me, my camera, my scars, and he didn't turn away. I didn't know if the past would come back, if it would remind me of itself, but I began to believe that I could be happy not for them, but for myself. 2 years after I left, I was at a photo exhibition, my first big one in the city center, where the walls were buzzing with voices and my photos were hanging under soft lights. I stood in the corner, holding a glass of wine, and felt pride mix with nervous trepidation. Nick was beside me, his hand on my back, and I smiled as I listened to people praise my work, the misty lakes, the city shadows, the moments I'd plucked from the chaos. I hadn't expected them there. I thought Portland was far away, along with their lies, but fate loves its jokes. I saw Sophie first. She stood next to my photo, a portrait of an old woman with arms like branches, and her hair shone under the lamps, just as red as I remembered. She was holding a glass, her lips curled in the same smile that had cut me once. I froze, feeling the wine warm in my hand, and then I saw Dan standing behind me, his shoulders broader but his eyes duller than in my memories. They didn't see me right away. They were talking to each other, their voices quiet, but I knew that tone, that lightness that had once suffocated me. I could have hidden, left, avoided them. But I didn't. I felt something inside me harden, like steel on fire. I put down my glass, squeezed Nick's hand, and walked toward them, my steps calm even though my heart was pounding. I stopped a few feet away, and Sophie turned, her eyes widening, her smile slipping like wet paint. Dan looked after her, and I saw his face go pale, blinking as if I were a ghost. I didn't say anything. I stood there, head held high, in a black dress that fit like a second skin, with a name tag that read, Liv Gray, photographer, on my chest. They didn't know what to say. I could see Sophie swallowing, her fingers clenching her glass, Dan shifting from one foot to the other. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse them. I just looked at them, feeling their strength melt away under my gaze. Nick came over, his hand found mine, and I felt his warmth, his calmness. I didn't introduce him, I didn't have to. They saw him, they saw me, they saw my photos on the walls, and I knew that cut them deeper than any words could. Their laughter, the one that called me boring, stuck in their throats, and I felt the air become mine. Sophie tried to speak, her voice trembling as she said something about how good I looked. I nodded without smiling and turned to Dan. His eyes darted over me, over Nick, over the gallery, and I could see him struggling with shock, with envy, with something he couldn't name. I didn't give them a chance. I turned and walked away, holding Nick's hand, feeling their eyes drilling into my back. I didn't look back, I didn't have to. I heard the crowd buzzing, people praising my work, and I knew they were standing there, small and lost in my world. I could have been triumphant, laughing in their faces, but I didn't feel it. I stood by the window, looking at the city lights, and felt something else, not joy, but calm mixed with quiet strength. They saw me, not broken, not bored, but alive, with a life that I built without them. Would they feel my strength? I turned to Nick, his smile warming me, and felt their shadows receding. But I didn't know it wasn't over, that their eyes would still burn with envy as I moved on. After that night, I returned to my work, to Nick, to the world I had built. The exhibition was a turnaround. My photos were spread across magazines, galleries called with offers, and I felt my wings soar. I wasn't bragging, I was just doing what I loved, capturing the world as I saw it, raw, beautiful, alive. Nick was by my side. We walked around the city, drank coffee in small cafes, and laughed at stupid jokes. I wasn't afraid anymore. His warmth became my home, and I knew it was real, not a lie I had once mistaken for love. I didn't look for news about Dan and Sophie, but the rumors reached me. Some of my old friends from Portland wrote. They had seen my photos online, heard about the exhibition. Dan and Sophie broke up. Apparently, shortly after that evening he drank more, she disappeared from town, and their lives cracked like an old fence in the wind. I read this as I sat on the couch with Nick, and I didn't feel joy at their fall. I felt empty, not because of them, but because their laughter had once meant so much to me. Now it was just noise, lost in the past. I could have gone back to Portland, thrown my success in their faces, but I didn't. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking at the lights of Seattle, and felt their shadows letting go of me. I didn't hate them anymore. They were just people who made a mistake, who thought they could break me and move on. But I didn't break. I grew up, and my roots were deeper than their poison could reach. I held the camera, feeling its weight, and knew that it was mine, not theirs. One evening, Nick took my hand and led me to the very pier where we met. He stood there, with paint on his sleeves, and I could see his eyes shining, not from the lights of the bay, but from me. He didn't say much, he just hugged me, and I felt warmth spread through my chest. I didn't know if it was forever, but it was now, and that was enough. I wasn't looking for promises, I was looking for truth, and with him I found it. We stood there, listening to the waves, and I felt the last thread to Dan and Sophie break, quietly, like a cobweb in the wind. I didn't know what they thought of me now. Maybe Dan is cursing the day he laughed, maybe Sophie is jealous when she looks at my photos in magazines. I imagined them sitting somewhere, separately or together, seeing my name live gray on the covers, in the galleries, in the life I had built without them. I didn't feel the need to know their thoughts, their pain, their envy were theirs, not mine. I let them see me that night, and that was enough, not for them, but for me to finally let go. Would I find peace? I walked down the street with Nick, holding his hand, and I felt the power flowing through me, not loud, not shouting, but quiet, like water grinding a stone. I didn't know if their eyes were still burning with envy, or if their hearts were shrinking from what they had lost. I didn't know if they realized who I had become, or if they still saw the boring life they had trampled on. But I knew one thing. I went on, with a camera around my neck and love in my heart, with a life that was mine and mine alone. And when I went to bed that night, I felt hope, not for them, but for myself, with a space where the questions remained, but no longer hurt.